Hi folks, today what we're going to do is talk about incorporating twisted wire into our handles and pommels. What I'm working on currently is the Gladius, and this is what my pommel is looking like. You can see I've cut in a groove. I've actually separated this into two pieces. So this is cut through the center here, and I've gone in with a file and just filed out this groove. I started with this small square file, and then I've gone in behind that with a small round file. And as you're cutting that in, what you want to be thinking about is how you want your wire to lay in. If you want it to lay in proud, or if you want it to lay in flush, or somewhere in between. So I'm kind of going with the somewhere in between, but doing it mostly set in, and so I have my twisted wire right here, and it's a bit of silver wire that I twisted up. And the way that I did that was I made this little hook that I use in a drill, and you can see that it had been attached right here. And so once you get it hooked into your drill, you make your loop and put these two ends in a vise and just twist until it's as tight as you would like it. Important thing is, after you twist, you want to anneal. You always want to make sure that you're working with nice soft material. So now this is all annealed. What I'm going to do is kind of just lay it in and take a look at where my overlap is. So right now you can see that as it lays in, I have just a small amount of overlap right there. It's hard for it to see right now because it's not focusing, but you can see the wire crosses here. And when you use wire cutters, when you're using a pair of wire cutters, what's going to happen is that cuts in at a bevel. Now, there are different ways of getting the wire to terminate and make a nice circle. A lot of people will drill a hole and then make little 90-degree bends and tuck those in. But that's kind of a pain in the butt to make sure that everything stays nice and tight if you're not laying it in over something flat. Wrapping it around, once you had this end at a 90, that's great. You set it in, you bend it around, you try to bend this at a 90 and get it to set in. Because it's a circle and a 90, things don't want to go in right, and so you got to mess around with it, and it's really hard to get it nice and tight. So that's the reason why for this I've cut it, and I'm basically going to be covering this seam that I've used. That seam I've used actually as my guide to cut in my little inset. So back to these cutting at a bevel. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you have enough overlap so that that bevel lines up with the end of that bevel lines up with the end of the bevel on the other side. So basically, you cut them at a bevel and then you file them flat, so you have two flat faces to come together. And then once you have that, you can then get these to solder together and hopefully have a nice joint there. So what I'm going to do is just get these guys nice and lined up. Pulling them nice and tight. Now I'm looking for the back of that. Comes nice and tight. So looking for the back of that bevel, which is where we're going to trim. Now also, one of the things is generally one side of your clippers is going to be, or your wire cutters is going to be a steeper angle than the other. So one side will have a longer bevel to it. So you can, this is generally the steeper side, going to the outside. And generally, by using that side, you have less of a cleanup to do. So now that's trimmed. These guys come together, and we still have a bit of overlap, but that's good, because what that means is I can now make another mark. The back of that bevel. And get these guys filed down so that they will meet nice and tight. Alright, so now I have the bit of twisted wire in the vise. You want to make sure that you don't have too much of it sticking up, because this is annealed, and so it will flop around all over the place if you have too much exposed. And what you really want to do is choose a file that has a nice fine tooth to it. Because if you go with a more coarser tooth, things are just going to flop all over. And I'm just going to file down to the edge of that mark. And now, so what I really want to do is I want to make sure that I don't go too far. So I'm just going to the edge of that mark that I put on there with the Sharpie. So that mark is still visible, and that way I can ease in on it and make sure that I'm not removing too much material. The other thing is that you want to make sure that the jaws of whatever vise that you're using don't have a lot of texture to them. So, one thing that we've done is just thrown in some thin copper as just a jacket over the jaws. And see, that's what I'm saying about things being very soft at this point. So, just need to flatten that back out. A super easy way to do that is use a pair of flat jaw pliers. Gets flattened out. Put back in here. Just about as low as we can go. And that gets filed down flat. I'll just go in and remove a little bit of a burr. Do that on both sides. Alright, and so now I have these guys flattened out, and you can see that they're not quite meeting up exactly right. So again, I'm going to grab those flat jaw pliers and just give a little bit of a tweak. Just a little bit more. Get these guys to come around so that the wires line up nicely. There we go. So you can see they come together. Once those guys get soldered, yeah, a little bit more, just a little bit. so close. There it is. So now they come together very nicely. Once those guys get soldered, then it'll just be a little bit of cleanup, and we'll have a nicely, hopefully perfect looking twisted ring. So now we have the ring in the vise. I've got them not lined up nicely, and we're going to apply a little bit of flux to that joint. And then we're going to be doing our soldering with a, it's a easy flow silver solder. It's the lower temperature of the silver solders, and just is a little bit more convenient for this. It's not a thing that needs to be particularly strong. And it also means that the flame doesn't need to be particularly hot. I'm also going to dip the end of my flux, or my solder in flux, just so that it is nicely coated. And now I'm going to start heating this guy up, making sure we're getting both sides hot. There you go, and there it is. Alright, so you can see the solder joint right here, and what I'm going to do is go in with a fine file and just clean things up a little bit, making sure I'm staying nice and in the in between the wires. So you can see, I mean, the joint may not be quite perfect, but it's pretty good, and it follows. The really important part is that the wires continue to flow through it, so it is not obvious to the eye. I think there's a little bit more that a little bit of a ridge in here, and just a little bit of filing takes that down. And that ends up being a pretty good joint. Here we have the final piece. I've put it in the pommel, I screwed everything together, and the joint is right there. You can kind of see it, but in general it is mostly invisible. So that is how to go ahead and incorporate a ring of twisted wire into either a pommel or handle.